This is a perennial digression, an ongoing experiment in imposing my thinly undiagnosed ADHD on others. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I have with me today Tom Keeline, Associate Professor of Classics at Washington University in St. Louis. Tom is the author of The Reception of Cicero in the Early Roman Empire, The Rhetorical Schoolroom, and the Creation of a Cultural Legend, and most recently, the editor and commentator for an edition of Cicero's Pro Malone for Cambridge's Green and Yellow Greek and Latin Classics series. I also hear that the research assistant he had for this book was really, really cool. Tom is a first-class master of Latin pedagogy, secondary language acquisition, lexicography, and grammar, and also he is a good friend of mine. Toma, mihi placet te viderique ate.
So, David, thanks for that very kind introduction, and thank you for serving as the research assistant on this book. You're pretty awesome.
The conversation I wanted to have with you today is chiefly about this book and how it connects to classics as a discipline and how it speaks to our context. I think it does in some interesting ways. First, though, I just wanted to take a moment to celebrate its publication with you, because you had started working on this, I think, like shortly before we met. And after I became your student and your research assistant, not long after COVID hit, and it upended everything. And now, like, the book is out. So tibi congratulor et axios.
Yeah, I'm glad it's out. I'm glad it's done. It's a process. I mean, these things are always a process, but it's a multi-year process, and you've pretty much been a part of it from almost the very beginning, because we did the class on Cicero's Pro Malone, and at that point, I had started the book. So this is a speech that has 105 sections. And I think by the time of our class, I'd done commentary on something like, I'll say 30 or 35 of the sections. So I was maybe a third of the way through, but that's really optimistic because that's like a third of the way through a very rough initial first draft. But that was way back in the year of our Lord, 2018, fall of 2018, I think. So I'd been working on it starting a little bit before then. I mean, starting in 2017, I think, though I lose track of time. And this is 2021. So yeah, that's 4 years at least from writing the first word to seeing it in print. And it might even really be a little longer than that. Certainly I'd had the idea, or the idea had been given to me even before that.
Yeah, I think I joked to you when you handed this off to me. This is like the longest investment that I've put into getting a free book out of something.
Yeah, totally not worthwhile. I mean, the paperback right now is $32.99. So like, if you divide that over the number of years, it has taken, like, totally not worth your wait. But
the next time I take my wife out to eat, I'm going to be like, Tom bought me this meal. Tom saved me this $32.
Yeah, somewhere like moderately priced. Yep.
Yeah. So I want to start here just to kind of introduce you to viewers a bit. I've heard a little bit of this story. I'm curious about your history with classics. How did you come to study Latin and Greek? How did you decide you wanted to do this as like a full-time career? How did you get in specifically? Because classics is such a broad tent, right? Like, how did you get into Cicero and Latinity and everything else?
Yeah. So you want my life story?
As far as you're comfortable sharing, and as briefly as you want to.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it relatively brief because I mean, people like to talk about themselves, and I certainly do. But I realize that other people don't like hearing other people talk about themselves. I started doing Latin because I was forced to. I went to a Catholic all-boys school from 7th grade through 12th grade, and everyone had to do Latin. And I hated it. Certainly to start, I really detested it. I thought it was pointless, useless, waste of time. And I wasn't very good at it to start. Not saying I'm very good at it now, but I definitely wasn't very good at it to start. I did, however, have a really good teacher in 7th grade who, like, basically sat me down and said, look, you're doing much worse at this than you need to do. And, you know, just kind of had a talk with me. And I won't say I, I won't say he turned things around. And I won't say I turned things around, but it did sort of change my attitude a little bit. And I didn't immediately fall in love with it or anything, and I didn't really like school, period. But nevertheless, I continued with a better attitude. And anyway, then when I got to be in ninth grade, I was given the option to take Greek also. And the choices were you can do Greek or you can do a fine art. So could have done, you know, painting or singing or whatever. But I'm a lousy singer and I can't draw and so on and so forth. And so not out of any love of Greek, but just sort of trying to choose the least of all the evils, I thought, all right, well, I'll do Greek too. So I started Greek then. And the Greek wasn't as sort of rigorous as the Latin. They took Latin very seriously. They took Greek moderately seriously, but it was, you know, it was in place of a fine art. So we didn't meet as many times a week. It wasn't as rigorous, I guess it's fair to say. Anyway, so I kept doing all this through high school. Had no intention of going to college at all because, like, you know, this whole college thing, whatever, wasn't for me. And anyway, when I was a senior in high school, I met this girl. We've now been married, let's see, 14 years. But anyway, yeah, so she was going to college. I decided, all right, whatever, I'll follow her. Hadn't applied to any colleges. All the application deadlines had passed. This was the spring of my senior year of high school. So I enrolled in community college that following year, and she went off to Tulane University in New Orleans. And the following year, I transferred down there, not because like I wanted to go to college, but because I wanted to be with her. So yeah, you're really getting my whole life story here, but I'll just keep going. Anyway, she was going to graduate college early for financial and other reasons. And I mean, also just because she could. And so she was going to graduate college in 3 total years. And that meant I had 2 total years because I'd already spent a year in community college. And so I looked around and thought, well, you know, what are the things that I could study and like finish in 2 years? And I'd been doing math. I'd done math at the community college. So math was a good candidate. And so I became a math major. And then I'd done all this Greek and Latin. And so I could just sort of jump in at a relatively advanced level in Greek and Latin. So I thought, all right, well, I'll sign up for being a classics major too. So I did. And it was there that I actually sort of started to like it more. And one thing led to another. I graduated, we got married. I worked briefly in the real world. My wife started medical school, and eventually I found my way back into graduate school at WashU, Washington University in St. Louis. And yeah, from that point on, it's actually been a pretty straight path. So I went from there, got my master's degree, went to Harvard, got my PhD, got a first job, which could have been a wonderful job where I stayed forever in Bellingham, Washington at Western Washington University. It was a great place, but then this job opened up at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm from St. Louis, my wife's from St. Louis. We applied to this job, got it, here I am. And so, yeah, that was a very, very long answer, but there you have it.
Now, I mean, I'm smiling both to hear your story and also because it's frequently been one of my favorite aspects of our friendship, how many like life parallels I have with you. I too am from St. Louis. I too hated the idea of going to college. I too went to a college to follow a girl that I met when I was 13, who I'm now married to. You know, I too sort of like reluctantly was like, all right, I guess I like things, you know, when I was in college. So yeah, and you, so I'll never forget kind of moving towards the class and the book and everything. I mean, I'll never forget my first seminar at WashU was the Promelone class. And, you know, ascending a literal tower, not made of ivory, but like a literal tower to talk about Cicero's Promelone and to do it in Latin using the Viva Voce method of Latin pedagogy was, I mean, like it was magic for me, right? Because I had already come out of a graduate degree and I'd come into that. So like some questions out of that. First of all, Um, maybe a side word about the Viva Voce method, why teach Latin through speaking, and why Cicero? Like, what kind of drew you specifically to Cicero in classics?
Yeah, let me start with why Cicero, maybe, because it's an easier answer, or a straightforward answer anyway. Um, when I was at Harvard doing my PhD, we had to choose a special author, a Greek special author, a Latin special author, and a special field to be examined in. And I was pretty sure I was going to write a dissertation on Latin poetry. And so I thought, okay, I should pick a prose Latin author because, like, broaden my horizons, and then I can sort of settle down and do this poetry thing. So I picked Cicero because Cicero wrote lots of words, relatively important figure, blah, blah, blah. It's an arbitrary decision, but not a crazy decision. If you're going to pick one Latin prose author to spend some time with, Cicero's like a pretty logical candidate. But I didn't pick him out of any love of Cicero. I just thought this will be good for me. This is like, I'm going to eat some vegetables here. So I did that for a year, and I met every 2 weeks with Kathy Coleman at Harvard, and she supervised my preparation for this part of the exam, this 3-part exam. And anyway, as I did it, I just found that I kind of like this Cicero guy, and there's a lot to do here. And then one thing led to another. So then I ended up writing this dissertation under the supervision of Kathy Coleman, focusing on Cicero, or on Cicero's reception. So that's why Cicero. And then, so I teach Latin in Latin. And the specific proportion of how much I teach in Latin varies depending on what class it is. So with absolute beginners, I just speak Latin because all we're doing is focusing on the language. In a graduate seminar, like the class that we were in, it's not all in Latin. I usually use Latin for the part of the class where we are focusing just on the text and what the text means. And then we switch to English when we want to talk about broader questions, cultural questions, historical questions, because it's just really hard for almost everyone to do that in Latin. You have to be really, really comfortable, if you want to talk about like literary theory in Latin. And I'm certainly not comfortable enough to talk competently about literary theory, even in English. So I'm not going to do it in Latin. And why do it? 2 reasons, 2 big reasons. First reason is it's fun. I say this and people always laugh a little bit, and okay, that's kind of funny, but it's also totally true. And, these people will disagree, and that's fine. But I think for a lot of students, a typical grammar and translation class is mind-numbingly boring. It's a great way to sort of kill any love or enthusiasm, or even like potential glimmerings of liking a language and a text and whatever. So one, I think it's just fun. Even if it has no other benefits, I think it's fun. 2, I think it does bring actual benefits. I think it helps you basically learn to read Latin with greater ease and pleasure. And the reason is, if you're doing it right, when you are speaking and listening to Latin, well, when you're exposed to Latin, let's say, not necessarily speaking it, but when you're in a classroom and hearing Latin and you're surrounded by Latin, you're getting a whole lot of so-called comprehensible input. And so you're getting a lot of stuff that's helping you form a mental representation of this language. And the idea is, if you get enough of this comprehensible input, you will start to form an accurate enough mental representation of the language that you'll be able to read it. Now, this is like very theoretical, and I actually have serious doubts whether anyone alive today has a sufficiently accurate mental representation of Latin that they can read it with no difficulty whatsoever. Different text, different people, blah, blah, blah. Lots of nuancing possible here. But I just don't think there are that many people. I don't think there's anyone, let's say, who, never having read Perseus or the satires of Juvenal or something like that, can just pick them up and read them with no difficulty. I could be wrong. I'd like to be wrong, actually, but I've not met such a person, and I'm certainly not such a person. But I think by speaking Latin, or let's say by hearing Latin, by being exposed to Latin, you're getting closer and closer to being able to do that. So it's not like making you magically able to do it, but it's getting you a little bit closer. It's more efficient. I think it's a more efficient way of doing business. And then again, as I said, to begin with, I think it's a more fun way of doing business. So the combination of being more efficient and more fun, and then like, let's not lie, I'm just sort of counter suggestible and contrarian. And so like, oh, this is a different thing. This is kind of cool. And, I'm enough of a, I don't know. This is like this tiny little province where you can do this thing and you can be relatively good in your tiny little province. And so there is an element of that too. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't, but I like to think that the reason I keep doing it anyway, or the reason I inflict it on students is fun, and that I think it has actual benefits to helping them read Latin better.
Yeah. So to second your point about no one alive having a perfect mental representation of Latin, certainly now that the late great Reginaldus has fallen asleep in the Lord, right? There's no one left alive who has a perfect representation of Latin. And on the student end of things, I can totally just kind of second what you're saying about the benefit of the sort of spoken model. I mean, I started out grammar translation with my near and dear teacher, Joseph Hughes down at Missouri State, who made grammar translation fun by teaching us to say things like salve nauta, novus in opido. It's like our first, bits of Latin. Or translating like classic rock songs into Latin, which was good fun. But I don't think Latin, Greek was always kind of my thing, and Latin was just sort of what I secondarily needed to know to get into classics. I think it was really like studying with you that made Latin great fun for me. And I try to do more or less the same thing with my middle schoolers when I teach it, right? And I think one of the things my students do like is that, it's basically charades. Right? Like I'm playing charades with them to try and trick their brains into knowing what I'm saying. And they love observing that.
Yeah. And it doesn't, I think this definitely doesn't just go for middle schoolers. I was amazed over this past year. I watched a lot of online first grade teaching in action because it was this past year, and I had a first grader at home doing virtual school, not for the whole year, mercifully, but for various parts of the year. And for the beginning of the year, definitely. And first grade teachers have incredible skills at keeping student interest, and all these little games, all these little phrases that they say, like they say mirror on, and then their students say mirror on, and then the students repeat back whatever the teacher says. They just have all these things, capiche, capash, like there's just all these different things. And I feel like, I was taking notes. Like I was like, there's so much I can steal from this incredible first grade teacher. Shout out to Miss Dicker at Conway School. There's so much I can steal from you, because this stuff that you're doing with first graders, you're not teaching a foreign language, but this is so applicable to teaching a foreign language. And little routines, starting every day with talking about the date, talking about the weather. This is so comprehensible input when you do it in Latin, because you are using the same vocabulary over and over again. You're building a little bit every day. You are creating a classroom community. You are using structured communication. So maybe the students don't exactly know what it means that today is, say, the 4th of August. Okay, fine. They're in first grade, whatever. Time is complicated. Talk about understatement, right? But when you do this every day, today's the 4th, tomorrow's the 5th, and you have a pattern, right? Today is the 4th. What was yesterday? Oh, yesterday was the 3rd. What is tomorrow? Tomorrow is the 5th. And you do that tomorrow, and you do that the next day. Soon enough, students start getting it. And so this is something I'm going to try to be doing actually in the Greek prose composition class that I'm going to be teaching in less than a month here. Students don't know numbers because no one ever practices numbers, right? But here's a dead easy way to learn numbers. Every day, what is today? What was yesterday? What's tomorrow? There's just so much. Anyway, I don't even remember how I got into this tangent, which is typical of me. But yeah, there's so much we can learn from middle schoolers, from elementary school. There's no reason not to be doing this stuff in our college classrooms, in any classroom, because we're teaching humans, like whatever their age.
Yeah. Sine cura cis on tangents. I mean, I did title this a perennial digression. So, and my private joke with that is it either means that there can be endless digressions, or it's the conundrum of if a digression is perennial, is it really a digression? Right.
That's right.
But yeah, I find that when I give my students more to do and more to say in Latin, the more they get into it. So like when I was teaching them basically like an overview of Roman history in Latin and getting them, to figure out what I was saying through charades and different kinds of things. And when we got to the Punic Wars, I had them all chant, and like we would repeat this frequently. Like they would all chant "Carthago dolenda est." So I had my supervisor at school like walked in one day when everyone was just like "Carthago dolenda est." I was like, "Great, yeah." So I'm teaching them young. So anyway, so Cicero, give us briefly sort of brief overview of Cicero's life. Who is he? Why does he matter for understanding ancient Rome? And then we'll kind of move into the specifics of the Promolone a bit more.
Yeah, so Cicero, 1st century BC Roman, we'll say politician, orator, author, essentially one of the most important figures from 1st century BC Rome. He's a so-called new man, which means he did not have family ancestors who had held high political office in Rome. No one had been consul. So consul is, you can think of it as, I know you know this, but I'm pretending that someone's going to listen to this.
Actually, like I don't know anything. Yeah.
So consul is essentially like the president of the Roman Republic, only there were 2 of them at the same time, and they only served for 1 year, 1-year terms. Anyway, so Cicero, he doesn't come from nothing. He comes from a comfortable middle-class background outside of Rome, but he really rises to the very highest ranks of Roman society based on his oratory and his skills as a lawyer, essentially. And so he takes part in all these big trials, makes a name for himself, and starts climbing the Roman cursus honorum, so the series of political offices that culminates in the consulship in the year 63 BC, which he held he held every single office in his youngest year of eligibility, which is, I mean, that's hard to do for anyone. It's super hard to do for a middle-class guy from outside of Rome. Now, again, not to sort of overplay this, he's not coming from an impoverished background or anything, but nevertheless, he's not coming from high Roman society. And in the late Roman Republic, these high political offices really were the domain of a certain aristocratic few. Anyway, so he becomes consul year 63 BC. And in that year, towards the end of that year, it so happens that Keeline, one of these aristocratic few who had hoped to be consul himself, had been disappointed in this ambition, decides to try to overthrow the Republic. And Cicero stops this. He suppresses this conspiracy. Let it be said, this is a high-level overview. We're skipping over a lot of details and subtleties, and all of these statements can be nuanced. And he's very proud, Cicero is, of having saved the Republic. And then he goes on over the next 20 years to continue to have a political career. But the political career, this gets complicated. We don't need to get into all the details, but suffice to say, as Julius Caesar comes more and more to power, Cicero basically loses power and influence. Again, like so much more nuance can be added to that, but let's just leave it at that for now. In the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, Cicero reluctantly sides with Pompey. that was the wrong side to pick if you were trying to pick a winner. But Caesar forgives him. It's even worse for Cicero politically after that. He really sort of feels he has no influence. Then unexpectedly, 44 BC, Ides of March, Julius Caesar's assassinated. Suddenly Cicero comes back to prominence again. And for the last almost 2 years of his life, year plus of his life, he is again playing a prominent role in Roman politics as a sort of senior statesman, giving advice, involved in all these controversies between Octavian, the man who becomes Augustus, the first Roman emperor, Mark Antony, another famous guy, and all these other political figures. But Cicero ends up possibly because of this political activity, running afoul of certainly Mark Antony, and I think probably the whole triumvirate, and they have him proscribed, which is to say, they issue a decree saying anyone can kill this guy, Cicero, and they won't be punished for it. In fact, you might be rewarded for it. So Cicero is killed. He is beheaded. His hand or hands are chopped off, and they are stuck up on the rostra in the Roman Forum, which is where he delivered his speeches. So that's the end of Cicero. That's his life, basically. And throughout this life, he's writing constantly. So he writes all these speeches. We have almost 60 preserved speeches. He writes treatises on oratory. He writes treatises on philosophy, on all different sorts of philosophy. He writes poetry. Most of the poetry hasn't survived. Poetry had a lower reputation in antiquity. And he writes letters. We have hundreds and hundreds of letters from Cicero and some to Cicero. And these letters, most of them anyway, were not designed to be published. And so we get we get to look over Cicero's shoulder as the late Republic is evolving and dissolving at the end, and see, this is what Cicero thought after breakfast, and then he sends this other letter after lunch and he's changed his mind. And so you really sort of get to know Cicero as a person. And yeah, again, infinite nuance. You're getting to know Cicero, the person that he's projecting to other people through his letters, blah, blah, blah. Okay, fine. But you're getting to know something about, you're getting really direct, not very mediated access to Cicero, to his thoughts. And so he is an invaluable source for the late Roman Republic, for history. He is the figure from classical antiquity whom we can get to know best as a person, because we just have so many things that he's written, and some of them, like his letters, are relatively unguarded. And sort of the kicker is he is an incredible prose stylist. He writes, I think, this is not a super controversial opinion, but not everyone agrees. He writes the best Latin prose of any Latin prose author, period. So he's kind of got everything going for him. Not everyone likes his personality, but this is partly also a function of the fact that we know so much about him. So, what we know about a Julius Caesar, say, who wrote quite a bit, but he has been so much more careful in shaping his image in what's published. We just can't sort of appraise any other figure from antiquity the same way that we can appraise Cicero. And so when we see Cicero changing his mind, or, lying or whatever, we can call him on it. And this has proved a disappointment to some people. But I think it just shows that Cicero is a human being. So it's not much of it's not a disappointment to me at all, in fact.
Yeah. I feel like Cicero, on the one hand, would have hated kind of looking, if he had a vantage to look back on the whole course of his life. I'm sure he would have hated the way that his life ends, but I'm sure that he would love the way that, to us, he kind of seems almost like a tragic figure. It's sort of the importance of that, I think he would have been, because I mean, he does go, and it's fascinating to consider this. Like, he goes from basically being the most powerful person in Roman society with the ability to address the Roman Senate and just say, guys, we should kill Catiline, right? Like, just, publicly say that in a series of speeches, to being like, just, summarily executed, basically, on the grounds of like illegal bounty for him.
Yeah, no, that's right. Yeah, I think Cicero would be thrilled to know that here on August 4th, AD 2021, we're sitting here talking about him. Like,
yeah,
what could make him happier?
he this is as it should be, he would think.
That's right.
So what's going on in the Pro Malone then? What is it? So you've kind of explained like why we have it. And among Cicero's other works, he wrote constantly. Many of them were preserved. He's this great prose stylist and rhetorician. So what specifically is going on in the Pro Malone? What occasioned it? What is its like publication history?
Yeah, so the Pro Malone is a speech from the year 52 BC. It's a defense speech that Cicero gives on behalf of his client, Milo, Titus Annius Milo. And Milo is accused of murdering Clodius, Publius Clodius Pulcher. Now, Clodius happens to be Cicero's arch enemy, and we don't need to sort of go through the whole story there, but one really important event that I left out from my summary of Cicero's life is that Cicero was exiled, and he was exiled because he had executed some of the Catilinarian conspirators from his consulship back in 63 BC. He'd executed these people without a trial. They were Roman citizens, and he had executed them without trial. So several years later, Publius Clodius, who has his own reasons not to like Cicero, and these would take us even further afield, digressions within digressions within digressions. Suffice to say, Clodius uses this action of Cicero's to have him exiled, to say, look, you really shouldn't have done that, and now you're in big trouble. Anyway, Cicero is exiled. He gets recalled from exile. It's a sort of, political struggle, but he comes back. And Cicero and Clodius really, really, really don't like each other. And this is an important part of it's a really important part of Cicero's life and Clodius's life in the 50s BC. And because of who Cicero is and who Clodius is, it becomes a pretty important part of Roman political life in the 50s BC. Not the most important part. Let's acknowledge that Caesar and Pompey are growing in power. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on in the 50s BC, but this is an important sort of one of the important storylines in Rome of the 50s BC. Anyway, Milo is Cicero's friend. Milo was one of the many people who helped get Cicero recalled from exile. And Milo doesn't get along with Clodius at all. And it so happens that Milo is essentially a gang leader. Clodius is also essentially a gang leader, though he is a very sort of high class. He is an aristocrat by birth. Clodius is. Milo, not so much. Anyway, again, simplifying greatly, blah, blah, blah. Milo and Clodius clash repeatedly throughout the 50s. But when I say that, I mean like their gangs clash and fight. They try to prosecute each other for various crimes and misdemeanors. And all this ends up coming to a head one day when Milo and Clodius, with their entourages, happen to pass each other on the Appian Way, a little bit outside of Rome. Something happens, a fight breaks out, Clodius ends up dying. There are many details to be discussed in that connection. We'll leave them out for now. Milo ends up on trial for the murder of Clodius. Clodius definitely died, like that's clear. he definitely died in a fight with Milo's people. That's also clear. The real question in the trial is, was this a deliberate ambush that Milo had set in order to kill Clodius? Or, as Cicero frames it, was this a deliberate ambush that Clodius had set to try to kill Milo, and the thing just went awry? Like things went sideways, and the ambusher, Clodius ends up killed. Because, it's a fight, things happen. This ignores this sort of dilemma. So these two options, pretending like these are the only two options, entirely ignores a third possibility, which seems almost certainly to be the real truth, insofar as we can recover it at this distance, which is that the two of them just stumbled on each other by chance. The fight broke out because, okay, I don't watch mixed martial arts, but I do live in the year 2021. I know when you get like these pre-fight press conferences or whatever, and you've got like the entourages of both fighters, like, things happen, right? So you can easily imagine a thing happening between Milo's people and Clodius's people. One thing leads to another. These guys are armed. These guys don't like each other. And Clodius ends up being killed. This is almost certainly what actually happened. But this is not the story Cicero tells. This is not the story the prosecution tells. The whole speech that Cicero gives is focused on proving that Clodius set an ambush for Milo. So he gives this speech. And he loses. Cicero loses. Milo goes into exile. But the speech is really a masterpiece. It's a masterpiece in so many different ways. And there are lots of sort of little details we can talk about. Well, we don't have to talk about them, but let's just say that like details can be added concerning all sorts of circumstantial details, including the delivery of the speech, the revision of the speech, the publication of the speech, blah, blah, blah. But it's a fine, fine piece of rhetoric, and it gives us a ton of insight into what is happening historically and politically at this time in 52 BC. It so happens this is the last extant speech of Cicero's until after the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. So shortly after this speech, Cicero goes off to be proconsul, to govern a province in essence. We know he delivered more speeches before he went off to his province, but we don't have them. He doesn't seem to have published them. When he comes back, basically the Civil War happens. He's not active in the courts then. After the Civil War, as I said, he picked the wrong side. Wrong side again in quotation marks, but he opposed Caesar. Caesar forgives him, but then, he's really sort of out of things. And he does then return in the year 46 BC. Is it 46? I think 46. It could be 47. This is always dangerous when you're being recorded and you dare to give a date and you might be wrong. But he returns. He gives 3 speeches, the Caesarean speeches, which are of a totally different character. And then at the very end of his life, he gives a series of so-called Philippic orations. And I don't really know why I'm digressing on all of this, because this is just like what classicists do. They give you the whole history of everything. My point was just, when Cicero delivers the Promolone, the Republic hasn't fallen apart yet. Things seem to still be functioning. No one knew in 52 BC that just a few years later, there's going to be open civil war, and certainly no one knew that 10 years later, we're going to be, the Republic's basically going to be over, right? So this speech is actually our last glimpse of the Roman Republic functioning more or less the way it's set up to function. I won't exactly say supposed to function. There's clearly a lot of dysfunction, but it unexpectedly not only, has all the most important people doing all these really interesting things, but just sort of, what no one could have foreseen at the time, this ends up being the last glimpse we can get of the functioning Roman Republic. So that makes it interesting too. I'm good at
So,
this digression.
a number of overlapping importances. I like the MMA reference, by the way, because when when you were talking about their respective gangs, all I could think of, honest to God, in my head was just like Milo's people like snapping at Clodius's people as they're walking towards each other in a European way. So okay, so yeah, so the Promelone, and I think we talked about this in the class, and I can't now remember if this was in the description you just gave, so forgive me if it was. But there's good reason to think that the Promelone was published not immediately, but later, right? Because the Senate had already proclaimed Clodius's death contra rem publicam, sort of limiting the kinds of arguments that Cicero can make. And yet in the extant Promelone, there's like an extended section, right, where Cicero is basically arguing, no, like it was a good thing for the Republic that Milo killed Clodius. So what does that tell us about Cicero's point, I guess, in preserving this speech as opposed to others?
Yeah, so when was this speech published? We can't know for a fact. We know it was published obviously sometime after it was delivered, and I think almost certainly before Cicero set off to be proconsul of Cilicia or Cilicia. I don't actually know how we say this thing in English, but anyway, this place, which was in 51. So there's like a period of just over a year where he might have published it. And I think there's a very, very likely time when he did publish it, which is early in the year 51. And there are reasons for it. And I mean, you can read all about my thoughts in my commentary, which is available for $32.99 from Amazon.com and find bookstores near you.
There will be a link in the channel, by the way.
I don't expect anyone to buy this book, but
please buy this book anyway.
But basically, I think that Cicero likely published this at a time when Pompey's popularity was relatively low, and Pompey was the one who presided over, well, I mean, this gets into so many details, but Pompey was an important figure at Milo's trial. Let's leave it at that. He created the laws under which Milo was tried. He was sole consul at the time. We said there's supposed to be two. Pompey was the only one at this time. It's complicated. Lots of stuff. Anyway, Pompey clearly wanted Milo to be convicted, no doubt of it. And when Pompey's popularity as a sort of low ebb after a series of trials, and one in particular where Cicero triumphed over some of Clodius's like minions is too prejudicial, but some of the people, some of like Clodius's adherents, let's say. These trials continued. Cicero managed to secure a series of convictions, and Pompey's popularity is low, Cicero's popularity is high, pro-Milo sentiment is high. Cicero, I think, probably published this speech at that time with a particular view, I think, to trying to get Milo recalled from exile, and trying to say, hey, this guy did a noble service to the Republic, and we really should want this guy here with us in Rome. He's a great patriot, a great Roman citizen. And so I think Cicero probably published it as a sort of pamphlet in this ongoing struggle, with the goal of helping to bring Milo back. And this is only fitting because just over 5 years earlier, Milo had been advocating to bring Cicero back. So Cicero owes Milo, like he owes him this specific favor. And so I think that's probably the circumstances and the reason that Cicero published it. There are other things. I mean, Cicero, by publishing this, sort of enshrines on the permanent record his version of events, like he's telling his story, because this is not just about Milo's trial. It's also about the whole history between Milo and Clodius and Cicero and Clodius in the 50s BC. And you might think, on the one hand, this ends with Clodius's death, so that's good for Cicero. But then you might say, well, it ends with Milo's exile. That's bad for Cicero. If Cicero can rewrite that ending, and especially if he can help recall Milo, then he tells the story the way he wants to tell it. And he's been reasonably successful at this because his version of the speech has survived, and we do have his version of events. We don't have Clodius's version of events. We do not have the prosecution's version of events from this speech. What we have is Cicero. So yeah, I think that's sort of the publication context. Can't be proved. Could be totally wrong.
Yeah. I will also say, for anyone who hasn't read it, but is desirous to, whether in Latin or in translation, Cicero's, not only is Cicero's speech utterly brilliant, right? Like, not only is his rhetoric flawless, his descriptions of Clodius are truly hilarious from time to time. Like there's no one, and I have some questions actually about, what Cicero can or cannot teach us for kind of our context at the moment. But like it just in terms of, if you want to have truly inflammatory rhetoric against someone, like, you can have no better master than Cicero. I mean, the guy is just like, he's unparalleled in his ability to just take down anyone, it seems, in term just with words. That kind of leads me, I guess, to my next couple of questions. So, and I've got all kinds of questions, but I want to be respectful of your time. So, people often like to compare kind of Republican Rome to the United States. Like, there have been various portions in American history where either crises or breakdowns in normative order have conditioned rhetoric, right, about that kind of look back to like the fall of Rome or to Rome's transition into imperium. The comparative potential is not unreal, right? It's not completely baseless. I mean, the founders consciously tried to model the Constitution on their imagined version of what the Roman Res Publica had been. They tried, in their minds, to prevent different loopholes and abuses that had led to the empire. I'm really curious what you think are like the legitimate limits of this kind of comparison. Like, what does Republican Rome have to say for us, like, about our own time? What can't it teach us about our own time? How does Cicero as a political figure, I don't know, like, what lessons can we legitimately draw from this? Because, we're in trouble, like, generally. I feel like no matter where someone falls on a spectrum, right, like, everybody can kind of agree things are not operating the way they're supposed to, theoretically.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question. I'm probably going to punt on it a little bit and be like a politician and sort of change the question. But I'm going to be super meta and self-conscious about the fact that I'm doing this. So at least maybe I get some credit for acknowledging the rhetorical trick that I'm trying to put into play here.
Nice praeteritio, by the way.
So yeah, I mean, it's totally right that there are points of comparison between then and now. The like overall general thing I'll say is, I think one reason that the Roman Republic is useful to think with is that there's a lot of distance between it and us, that it's similar enough to us that, okay, we say, oh, that's a republic, people vote, there are elections, whatever. But it's different enough. It's 2,000 plus years in the past. None of us have any like real emotional investment in the outcome of the Praetorian elections of 68 BC, right? Like, whatever. So we can look at it dispassionately in a way that I think is very difficult to do with things happening now. I mean, I think it's good to try to look dispassionately at things happening now, but I think it's just really, really hard. And even if you as an individual can do it, it's probably really hard to convince like your neighbor and all sorts of other people you might talk with to think in the same like cool, rational, level-headed way. So I think it's useful to think with because it is similar but different, basically. One way that I think Cicero is useful to think with in particular actually is just the rhetoric of Cicero. So we can really clearly see, because we're sitting here 2000 plus years later, what Cicero was doing rhetorically. Yeah, okay, so we're missing like lots of cultural context that we would have gotten, that we would have understood had we been there in 52 BC or 63 BC or 43 BC. But because we have all this distance, we can, and because we also always read very slowly, because this is the nature of reading Latin, we really linger on every single thing he's saying, and we sort of unpack it and we think, well, why is he saying this? And is this true? And what is the point of using this word and that word? And on the one hand, you do too much of this and you can, like I said, you can kill a text, because suddenly you're not reading, you're just sort of parsing and looking things up in the dictionary. But on the other hand, you can get a lot of meaning out of that text, and you can really try to understand its rhetoric. And I think that's useful because rhetoric hasn't like really changed all that much. I mean, everything that a politician says now is rhetorical. Everything that an advertisement on TV or whatever says, I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about like, buy this thing, that is rhetorical. They are trying to persuade you to do a very specific thing. And so I think the more you can understand about rhetoric, the better equipped you are to just function as a human being at any time, and particularly, I guess, now. I mean, whether we're worse now than we were in 1968, I mean, I don't know. I'm who knows? I'm not a politician, but you want to be able to decide for yourself, insofar as it's possible, whether you want to, buy an iPhone, and whether you want to vote for so-and-so. Like, and because all these things, all these choices are being presented to you through rhetorical means, you've got to know something about rhetoric to evaluate them. Or maybe you don't have to, but I think it helps. I think it helps to know something about rhetoric. I think it lets you step back a little bit and evaluate the claims and evaluate what people are doing. And I mean, maybe you're still taken in, maybe, we're so deeply embedded in this society that we can't possibly get outside it and look from another perspective. And like, yeah, there's all sorts of deep theoretical things, but in some fundamental practical sense, like, I think knowing about rhetoric helps you. And I think looking to Cicero is useful to learn something about rhetoric, because he's such a good model, and because we're so distant from him that we can evaluate his rhetoric more objectively.
So closely connected to that, I mean, one of the things I love about the digression model is that actually the digressions of the people that I talk to and my own usually take me where I want to go in my questions. So, I mean, Cicero is this unmatched teacher in how to use language persuasively, right? I mean, he is, you can read Quintilian, or you could just read Cicero and do what Cicero does, right?
You can read both. I would advise you to read both, but life is short. Both. Life is short.
Yeah. In our cultural context, I mean, the quality of our rhetoric is habitually poor. Like in our society right now, like, we don't have common criteria for determining truth that we can sort of all look to. I don't know that any stage in human history have we ever necessarily had a universal set of criteria for determining truth, but certainly we have a dearth of it now. I'm wondering, like, is Cicero valuable? Sorry, I have to let my dog in and out as I do these. Is Cicero valuable as a teacher, not just in how to use language persuasively, but how to use language to tell the truth? Like, to what extent does convenience shape Cicero's commitment to truth? Because obviously Cicero fudges periodically, he lies periodically, but like, yeah, I don't know. What do you think of, what do you think?
Yeah, deep question. So truth with a capital T. Yeah, I guess my initial reaction is, yeah, probably we've never known objectively how to evaluate truth. If we did, like, we'd have solved so many problems in the world, in life, the universe, and everything. And I don't know whether the quality of rhetoric today is poor or not. It's an interesting question to think about. Like, how do you evaluate it? Because if it's effective, right? Like, if people are being persuaded even if you might say, I find this rhetoric aesthetically displeasing, or this is just a pack of lies. That's like, I mean, aesthetically displeasing is how scholars talk. This is just a pack of lies, is how people talk. If that pack of lies is nevertheless persuading people to take a certain action, then in that sense, that was super effective rhetoric, right? Like if that accomplished what the speaker wanted it to, then yeah. Cicero is a big time liar. Does Cicero have regard for the truth?
So to put context on that, I'm thinking in terms of, Cicero has always interested me a little bit more as a philosopher than as a politician, because he's sort of endlessly counter-suggestible, right, with regard to his philosophy. I mean, he flips back and forth between the more skeptical take on the academic tradition and Stoicism and Epicureanism, and he's either an eclectic or he thinks it's all stupid. Like, it just kind of depends on what you're reading from him. I was reading the Balbus's portion of De Natura Deorum not long ago, and I was thinking about this, that like Cicero is devoting so much time and energy to a viewpoint that he really respects. And I also know he like wouldn't fully say he believes it either, and so I'm interested in to what extent his sort of philosophical interest in truth, both like contingent truths that relate to very practical things like politics or like day-to-day life, and maybe, bigger T truth. Does that shape his rhetoric at all, or are those just completely separate enterprises for him?
It's a good question. So yeah, I'm sure they can't be completely separate because we're talking about one person and things don't live in sort of neat boxes and just stay in those neat boxes. That said, I mean, in his speeches, it really does seem like he's mostly just concerned to accomplish whatever his sort of rhetorical ends are in that speech. So get Milo acquitted or have Milo recalled from exile or whatever. And it's not like he just has one goal, presumably. I mean, yes, he wants to argue on behalf of his client, but he also wants to, make himself look good or do other things. But by and large, he's very good at doing those things. I mean, like he really directs his speech towards those goals. And I think almost everything he says can usually be profitably analyzed as directed towards those goals. Now, if he can have truth on his side, so much the better, right? Like if you can argue the facts, argue the facts. But if you can't argue the facts, like argue the law, slander your opponent, like do whatever. So I think in his speeches, my impression anyway, is that even though he wouldn't say this, because this would be undercutting everything he's doing, I think expedience trumps all. Could be wrong. I don't know. I mean, it's sort of hard to keep all of his speeches in your head at one time. I read through all the speeches in writing the commentary, yeah, so I've read them all, but I don't, yeah, anyway. Now on like the more philosophical question, that's tricky. I mean, it's just really tricky. Like, what is Cicero doing in his philosophical works? I'm going to again sort of avoid the question a little bit, but hopefully make a productive observation, which is that Cicero's philosophical works are dialogues. They're not like straight treatises where he just says, this is what I think. They take the form of, here is a character who puts forward one point of view. And then here's another character who puts forward another point of view. We got an Epicurean, we've got a Stoic, we've got this, we've got that. And these guys, and I think they are without exception men. So these guys, they fight it out. They intellectually duke it out, always like in super friendly terms. These are not, so Cicero is a master of slander and invective in his speeches, but in his philosophical treatises, I mean, these are these are gentlemen, as my learned friend says, blah blah blah.
Yeah,
It's very,
it's fiction when someone's being nice to the Epicurean.
yeah, they're
Philosophical
super nice. And so anyway, Cicero's own views, you have to sort of reconstruct them out of these different characters and the arguments that they make. And you have to sort of say, well, does it seem like Cicero likes this argument? Does he present it in a persuasive way? How has he arranged this? And I mean, it's tricky. So I don't know. And yeah, this is a really long-winded way of saying I don't know, and that I think it's quite hard actually to get access to exactly what Cicero thinks, because he doesn't just come out and tell us, like, this is what I, Marcus Tullius Cicero, think about question X, Y, or Z. So it is, I mean, it's a super sophisticated literary presentation of these issues. And I mean, that also plays into its complicated nature, because it is in this literary tradition of dialogues, philosophical dialogues. Plato's writing dialogues. Like, this is a thing that you do. You write philosophical dialogues. So yeah, long-winded way of saying I don't know.
Yeah.
I could have just said I don't know, but then I wouldn't be an academic. So
yeah. If you're going to be an academic, say I don't know in at least a paragraph.
Right? At least, I mean, but preferably 10 minutes of just monologue.
Yeah, I chuckled to myself reading the introduction to a book recently on the development of episcopoi in early Christianity, where the author described chapter 5 or something as, this is an extended argument for ignorance. It's like, excellent. Like, I wish I could get paid for saying I don't know things.
It's crazy that we get paid to do this. Yes.
Yeah. On the subject of things unknown, so Cicero has a ton of material. There's a scholarly tradition around Cicero. What for anyone who's going into college or graduate school, who's aspiring to maybe classics specifically, or more broadly classics adjacent disciplines, what I don't know, what are the frontiers of the discipline at the moment, and what's been overdone? Like what if someone wants to do something original, so like you kind of stumbled across Cicero, you described in your education, like what should students be looking at? What needs more love?
Yeah, that's a good question. My gut reaction is to say, okay, my gut reaction is to say, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. But I'm suppressing that because that's not a useful reaction. My gut reaction beyond that is to say, if you're interested in whatever, Cicero, Virgil, Tertullian, doesn't matter. Just pursue whatever the thing is you're interested in, and that will naturally lead you to useful avenues of inquiry. And anyway, you're going to have fun while you're on that journey, because you're reading and studying the things you like. My gut reaction is not to try to figure out, before you've sort of done the thing, the best way to do the thing, not least because it's kind of a moving target also. Like, I mean, if you happen to be graduating with your PhD in this year and you were studying topics of race and ethnicity in classics, you would have probably chosen right. Like, that is likely to be a hot topic right now. But who's to say, 20 years ago or 20 years from now, whether that will be the same. And because, it takes a long time, relatively speaking, to go to graduate school and write a dissertation and publish a book, the thing that's super hot right now might not be super hot by the time you're done with that process. So, like the kids say now, you do you, man, and like it's gonna be fine, or it won't be fine. I don't know. Like I should not say it's gonna be fine, but I should say if you're doing the things that interest you, then the journey is likely to be worthwhile, whatever the destination may be. So there you go. There's some trite proverbial stuff for you, but I mean, I think true stuff actually.
Yeah. So kind of as a closing question, because I want to be mindful of your time, but related, I mean, slightly more personal. So you described, you're a family man, you're a husband, you're a father, in addition to being a classic scholar. As you know well, and as you know that I know well, contemporary academia is like often antithetical to family life, right? To trying to do traditional family life in several forms. And those who sort of, feel called to marriage or raising children or starting families or whatever, and have academic interest and ability, often end up finding themselves kind of on the outside of academia. This can be kind of a traumatic experience. This can be kind of a liberating experience. I think it just kind of depends on who you are. How do people in that situation, wink, wink, continue to participate in classics in relevant academic fields? Do you think that there's a future for the field in general in this kind of more like lay scholarship, so to speak, especially as like academia continues to be more restrictive and less hospitable to most good things, right?
Yeah, so academia is complicated, and whether it is hospitable or not, we can definitely all agree that it is open only to a very small number of people. Even just like to leave all politics out of it, there just aren't that many jobs, right? Like considering the number of applicants for a job, there just aren't enough jobs. So the vast majority of people who study classics, even the vast majority of people who go on to get a PhD in classics, are not going to work at a tenure track job for their career. That's just not going to be the thing they do. And there's so much to say about this, and I could talk for years about it, right? But let's just stipulate that that is the case. So I think there has to be, classics has to, and all academic disciplines, and I mean, if classics only lives in the academy, it's totally dead, right? It is just maybe barely being kept on life support by a few people in the ivory tower. If the only reason people learn Greek and Latin is to like take these classes and then get a grade and then graduate and then they never read Greek and Latin again, then it's just totally pointless. Like what I was gonna say what a waste of time and treasure. And that's overly judgmental because I have studied many things because I am a human being, and I do not continue to study all the things that I have once upon a time studied. And yet I'm not saying that it was a waste of time that I spent a semester learning Old English, or that I once upon a time was a math major and now rely on my wife to calculate the tip at dinner. Like, it's not a waste of time that I did those things. But basically, yeah, if you only read Latin for school, then Latin doesn't have much of a life, right? On the other hand, there's absolutely no reason that Latin or Greek or scholarship should be confined to an academic setting. Like, if this stuff has meaning, if this stuff is worth reading, then it's just meaningful and worth reading, period, whether you're in school or not. And so, one way for me, and this is sort of going back in time for me, and well, when I graduated from college, I started working in the real world, and I was in financial services, and that sounds like much more glamorous and much more high paid than it actually was in my case anyway. I was saying that once upon a time, when I was working in my job in financial services, after I got off work, I would go home, and that is the first time I read Homer. And I just decided, like in Greek, I decided, okay, I'm gonna read the Iliad. We're gonna start book one, line one. We're just gonna keep going until we get to the end. And it was, it's a process. I was doing it after work. Took a while, but it felt worthwhile to me. Like it felt worthwhile to me, and I wasn't doing it because like there's going to be a test or whatever. I was just doing it because I wanted to. And to me, that was kind of a sign that, like, if this is the thing that I'm doing just because I want to do it, maybe, well, if I could like con some people into paying me to do this thing, then maybe I would have really won in life. And so I think, yeah, I've kind of lost the thread here, but basically, classics has to live on in that way. I mean, if we don't have people who read Homer in Greek just because they want to, like we've totally failed as an academic discipline. And this goes for scholarship too in different ways. Basically, there's no reason you need to work as a professor or be a graduate student if you want to do scholarship. There are certain advantages, to be sure, right? One is access to resources like libraries, and another is time. So, I mean, I am getting paid to research, teach, and do service. And so, like, it is expected by the university that I spend some percentage of my time like reading books and writing words, and I am being paid for that. Ordinary people don't enjoy that advantage. So they're going to have to maybe take time that they would have been doing something else and do scholarship if they want to. But basically, if you like it, then you should totally do it. You don't have to be in the academy to do it. And if you don't like it, you shouldn't do it, because there's no reason. Like, so if you were a professor and you hated scholarship, I mean, maybe you should change jobs. But like, let's say for whatever reason you don't want to change jobs, well, then you probably just need to like buckle down and do the scholarship because it's your job. And if you don't do it, then pretty soon you're going to have to change jobs. But one advantage, I guess, if you're outside the university, you can do whatever you like entirely because it's what you like. And it doesn't even necessarily matter. I mean, you can just follow your passions, basically. And so, yeah,
that's not what Cicero would tell us, right? Follow your dreams.
That's Cicero. He was always saying, follow your bliss. I mean, people attribute that quote to some other guy, but it's totally Cicero.
We're a couple minutes over where you had told me you needed to quit. So I'll just say, Tom, it's always good talking to you and seeing your face. And I hope that if there's good reason and you are agreeable to it, we can do this again sometime. And otherwise, thank you so much for this today.
Yeah, thank you, David. It has been a pleasure. I hope I didn't say anything too completely stupid, but it's always a risk, and it's a risk that I am willing to take. So yeah, thank you very much.
Bene vale o toma.
Tu quoque optime vale.